Hi, Mr. Loomis. Welcome back for the sixth and final lesson about the social revolution. We've been spending a lot of time talking about big changes that happened in America, many of them during the 1960s. As it turns out, some people were getting tired of change and started to think that the old, traditional ways might not be so bad after all. And that is how America swung back to being more conservative again. That's today's story. Let's get a preview. We're going to begin by talking about liberalism and conservatism, so you'll understand these two ideas and just what it meant that we had a conservative revolution. We'll talk about Ronald Reagan, the first president of this new conservative way of thinking, including his election in 1980 and the people who supported him. We'll talk about his ideas for the economy, the Supreme Court, and something we call the culture wars. Let's get started. To understand the move from liberalism to conservatism, it's important to understand what these two terms mean and the other names people use to describe them. When we look at the world, and government especially, some people see problems and think that everyone should join together to use their collective power to make change. These people are liberals, and in their view, the best way to join together is through the power of government. For example, Lyndon Johnson decided that poverty was a problem Americans could solve. To do this, he increased taxes and then used the money for programs like college loans and welfare. By paying taxes, everyone contributed to working toward a solution that no one could have solved individually. Because these ideas require the government to be involved in people's lives and to take more of Americans' money, the liberal approach is called big government. In the past century, Democrats have been the liberal party. Another way to describe them is to say they are on the left. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal and Barack Obama's stimulus are two other examples of liberal, big government, left-wing solutions in action. An entirely different approach is conservatism. Conservatives think that people know best what to do with their money and that they will make good choices about saving and spending because the money is their own. When government takes their money in taxes, politicians and bureaucrats have less incentive to spend wisely because the money is not really theirs. Conservatives fear that America's wealth is wasted by big government schemes. They want fewer taxes and less regulation of businesses. Big government takes away their freedom by taking away the fruits of their labor. Why should a person work hard, they ask, if politicians are going to force them to give away their profits and high taxes? For this reason, conservatives believe in small government and are on the right politically. Republicans have been the conservative party in the past century. Some examples were Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover in the 1920s, as well as Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and his son George W. Bush. For a long time, Americans wanted change and liked liberal ideas. But in the 1960s and 1970s, some people thought liberals had gone too far. They were tired of high taxes and frightened by how fast the world was changing. Conservative Senator Barry Goldwater argued that it was time for a shift back to conservative government in his 1964 presidential campaign. He believed big government was the biggest threat to American freedom and that social spending and welfare needed to be cut. Although Goldwater didn't win the election, some Americans started to think he might be right, and his ideas began to catch hold. Importantly, leaders of big businesses began supporting politicians in the new right. When politicians make laws or give speeches, they often borrow ideas from experts who spend time working on the details of how a political philosophy, like conservatism, can get turned into reality. The Heritage Foundation was created in 1973 to do just that. The Heritage Foundation pays experts to write articles that explain conservative ideas and come up with suggestions for laws that Congress can pass. Around that same time, William Buckley started publishing a magazine called National Review that was also important in explaining and promoting conservative ideas. They focused on traditional values that they thought were being threatened by the changes happening in the 1960s. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, He listened to the Heritage Foundation's recommendations and even hired some of their thinkers to work in the White House. The foundation still supports conservative ideas today. During the 1970s, a powerful group called the Religious Right joined the conservative movement in America. Christian leaders have been involved in politics for a long time. One famous example was the Scopes trial in 1925, when religious conservatives were trying to stop schools from teaching Darwin's theory of evolution because it conflicted with the Bible's story of creation. In the 1970s, the religious right began reorganizing and getting involved in politics again. The Christian right was not one group with one leader, but more of a collection of people who had similar goals. But there were important Christian leaders at this time. Some, like Jerry Falwell, believed in a strict interpretation of the Bible. Others, like Pat Robertson, believed that the Holy Spirit communicated directly with people. But despite their differences, all of the religious leaders agreed that America was becoming more immoral. They preached that homosexuality was wrong and that women should stay home to take care of their families. They criticized what they saw as liberal media, such as TV, movies, and music that was promoting things like drugs, premarital sex, and radicalism to young people. They didn't like that religion was being taken out of public schools, and they encouraged parents to have their children go to private Christian schools or homeschool instead. Many Catholics agreed with the religious right. During the 1960s, many reforms had been made in the Catholic Church. At a meeting called Vatican II, Catholic leaders agreed that the Mass, the Catholic Church service, could be conducted in the local language instead of Latin. However, some conservatives worried that Catholic traditions that had been around for centuries were being swept away by liberals who did not care about biblical truths or morality. The leaders of the religious right liked traditional ideas, but they were not old-fashioned. They were well organized and used technology to spread their message. For example, Pat Robertson created the Christian Broadcasting Network to reach more people. They built huge databases of supporters that they could tap into when they needed donations. In 1979, Jerry Falwell created the Moral Majority, which was a group that raised money to defeat politicians who they thought were too liberal. They tried to control local school boards by promoting candidates who would vote for conservative ideas. When Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1980, he happily accepted donations from the religious right. As the religious right grew, some voters started picking candidates based on their social views and not on their economic or foreign policy ideas. We call these American voters values voters. For them, a candidate's opinion about abortion, divorce, school prayer, and church attendance are what matter most of all. Let's learn a little bit more about how Ronald Reagan was able to turn a shift towards conservatism into an electoral victory in the 1980 presidential election. Reagan was able to win votes from Americans who had never before supported a Republican candidate for president. This new coalition included working Americans who were worried about high unemployment rates, inflation, and high taxes. Reagan promised to help them by cutting government spending and lowering their taxes. Southern voters who were unhappy with affirmative action and busing also found a friend in Reagan. He continued the Nixon Southern strategy and won over white Southerners. Catholics had voted for Democrats for years, but many began voting Republican when Reagan promised to oppose abortion and promote family values. Even women who were in the middle of a movement for equality in the 1970s voted for Reagan. He was wise not to oppose the ERA, even though he didn't say he was in favor of it either. And it turned out that many women were worried about their families, and Reagan's promises of helping the economy resonated with them. City dwellers who were worried about rising crime also looked to Reagan for comfort. He portrayed himself as a law and order candidate and promised to make America strong again, both at home and in the Cold War fight against the Soviet Union. Some former members of the counterculture who had grown up and started families also supported Reagan. These yuppies, short for young urban professionals, now had jobs, families, house payments, and car loans to worry about. Reagan sounded like a good choice to these young adult baby boomers. Reagan's ability to bring together Republican voters with these new groups, the so-called Reagan Democrats, ended up forming a majority of American voters. Ever since Reagan's first victory in 1980, Republicans have tried to appeal to this same coalition of Americans to win elections. Once Ronald Reagan became president, he had to work on fixing the economy, which was not doing well. Instead of creating new government programs to fix people or to give people jobs, the way FDR had done during the Great Depression, Reagan thought that getting rid of government programs and lowering taxes would fix the problem. He thought that if people were able to keep more of their own money, they would spend it and the economy would start to recover. He captured this idea in a famous quote from his first speech as president. He said that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. Newspapers nicknamed his idea Reaganomics. He believed that if he cut taxes for rich people, they would invest more in businesses, factories, and the stock market. And this would create more jobs for people with less money. He thought that he could cut taxes because if more people were working, more people would be paying taxes, and the government would still get enough for what it needed. To help businesses grow, Reagan also wanted to deregulate industries or get rid of some of the rules they had to follow. Some people, including Republicans, didn't like Reagan's plan. Even his future president, George H.W. Bush, had called it voodoo economics. When Reagan proposed a big tax cut, Congress didn't vote for it because they thought it would only help rich people. So to convince Congress to support him, Reagan talked directly to the people to get them on board. Reagan was known for being a great speaker. He used jokes and a friendly tone to make people feel like they could trust him. People liked listening to him talk about how things used to be before the government got too big. After an assassination attempt in 1981, Reagan's popularity grew even more. This helped him get the support he needed to pass his tax cut plan, and in 1981, Congress passed the Economic Recovery Tax Act, which lowered taxes by 25% over 3 years. Reagan lowered taxes, but he didn't do as well at cutting government spending, even though he talked about how bad big government was. He spent less money on programs that helped the poor families like welfare, food stamps, and job training. However, he started the Department of Veterans Affairs, and more people got jobs working for the government while he was president. He also didn't change Social Security or Medicare, which helped the people who supported him. In fact, he worked with Democrats in Congress to get more money for Social Security in 1983, which meant that people had to pay more taxes. Regulation was another important part of Reagan's plan to fix the economy. Reagan wanted to make it easier for businesses to make money by reducing the rules or regulations they had to follow. He cut back on rules banks had to follow. The Environmental Protection Agency, which made sure companies did not pollute the environment, also had less power. This made many people who cared about the environment angry. The government also made it easier for companies to cut down trees for lumber and paper and to drill for oil on government land. Reagan did not like labor unions. In 1981, he fired thousands of air traffic controllers who had gone out on strike. This led to the end of their union, and other employers started to do the same thing. This made it harder for workers to demand better wages and working conditions, which is why the average pay that workers earned did not go up much during the 1980s. Our next topic, the culture wars, is something that started in the 1980s, but is still very much going on today. During the 1980s, social and religious conservatives who supported President Reagan started what we now today call the culture wars. Pat Buchanan, a speechwriter for Nixon, later presidential candidate, described the conflict as a religious war for the soul of America. He believed that preserving traditional values was the key to America's greatness. Although President Reagan was not a social warrior like Buchanan, many conservatives worried about changes in the country's moral values during the 1980s. One battleground for the culture wars was the entertainment industry. Conservatives worried about the messages their children were hearing in movies, TV, and especially music. A group of the wives of Washington politicians started the Parents Music Resource Center, PMRC, in 1985. They wanted to stop children from hearing explicit and violent lyrics by convincing the recording industry to use a rating system for music that would be similar to the ratings movies have. the PMRC produced a list of particularly offensive recordings known as the Filthy 15. When Congress threatened to pass a law forcing the music companies to use a rating system, they agreed to put a generic label on their recordings, warning parents about explicit lyrics. We still use this same system today. The culture wars are still going on. Abortion, LGBTQ rights, books in school libraries, what we teach in history classes, and saying Happy Holidays or Merry Christmas are all current examples of the culture wars that have been raging since the 1980s. We're going to finish with a quick discussion of how Reagan and the conservative revolution affected the Supreme Court. One way presidents can influence the country is by choosing who becomes a judge, including those on the Supreme Court. As a conservative, Ronald Reagan chose judges that shared his beliefs. During his time as president, he picked 3 Supreme Court justices, one of whom made the Chief Justice. One of Reagan's choices was Antonin Scalia, who was a strong believer in following the Constitution exactly as it was written. Scalia was on the court for 30 years and was usually on the conservative side. Over the years, the Supreme Court made more rulings that conservative Americans liked, in part because of the... But for Reagan, being conservative didn't mean he was totally against change. He picked Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman to be a Supreme Court justice. She was a moderate and sometimes voted with the liberals on the court. Reagan's 4th choice was Anthony Kennedy, who over the years turned out to be a moderate justice. Many times, he had the deciding vote between the 4 conservative and 4 liberal judges on the court. When Kennedy retired in 2018, President Trump chose a conservative named Brett Kavanaugh to replace him. This changed the court again and made it more conservative. And that concludes our lesson, and also our unit. Before we go, let's recap today's big ideas. From the 1930s through the 1960s, Americans turned to big government, liberal ideas like the New Deal and Great Society to fix problems in society. In the 1970s, Americans turned away from these liberal extremes and embraced ideas that are more conservative. This was the conservative revolution. With help from these new right conservatives and the Christian right, Ronald Reagan won the presidency in 1980. He was a champion of conservative ideas about taxes, government spending, and social norms. Reagan wanted tax breaks for the wealthy and businesses. He believed this would create economic growth because businesses would have more to spend to hire workers, and that eventually everyone would benefit. In the 1980s, culture wars raged. Social conservatives tried to censor music and promoted conservative candidates in elections. Reagan and other Republicans have nominated conservatives to the Supreme Court. Thank you very much. As you can see, America went from being socially conservative in the 1950s to being super excited about change in the 1960s and back to being conservative again in the 1980s. Make sure to use the review guide and the Quizlet sets to be ready for your test, and I'll see you next time when we'll be talking about some times when America failed. I'll see you then.
Come on, people now, smile together, everybody get together.